Thanks for joining me on the Buddy Bench since we're going through this sermon series of conversations between women of the Bible where we imagine them sitting on a bench. I thought that this week I'd sit on a bench as we have a conversation between mother and daughter-in-law, Naomi and Ruth. Rather than just a conversation though, this week I've asked Ruth to interview Naomi. So we're just going to jump straight into that, this interview between Ruth and Naomi. And Ruth begins asking the first question. Thanks for letting me interview you, Naomi. I know there's a book of the Bible with my name on it, and unfortunately that seems to obscure your part of the story. And so I'd like to hear you flesh it out some more today for us and for our audience. As we begin, can you tell me why you and Elimelech, your husband, decided to move the family to Moab? Naomi responds, well, I certainly appreciate your interest in my story. Not that there's really all that much to tell. As you know, Joshua and Caleb passed away after Israel came and took possession of the promised land. And after they were dead, there really wasn't much of a leadership structure in the country. Each tribe and each region got along as best it could. If we had a problem, we'd go to our town elders and they would attempt to sort it out for us. Or if we were really desperate, we could travel and go to find a judge that God had appointed, or perhaps a prophet who spoke with God. But there was no one in charge of the country. And so every region did kind of its own thing. And over time, people forgot our history, our story. And many people even forgot our God. Certainly there was nowhere to worship, there were no really effective priests, and there was nobody teaching us to keep God's law, or even what the law was. As a consequence, as people worshipped other idols, we were often invaded by bandits from other nations. And then on top of all that, there was a famine. We owned some land here in Bethlehem, but we couldn't get anything to grow. So we packed up the boys and went around the Dead Sea to Moab to try and make a living. It really was a terribly difficult decision for us. Our extended family was here in Bethlehem, and after all the adventures our people had gone through to get to the promised land, everything that Moses and Joshua had fought for and accomplished, we felt like failures for leaving the land to go to Moab. But we knew that we'd be living among idol worshippers and that God didn't really want us to do that, but we had to find food. That's what happens in a famine. Ruth responds, well, I'm personally glad that you went to Moab, but I understand the struggle. Now, you were there 10 years, right? But things didn't really go as planned? Right. 10 years. We had food, but Elimelech died. And then shortly after Mahlon and Chilion were married, they married you and Orpah, they died, one after another. I felt like the worst woman in the world. I'm sure it was God's judgment on us for leaving Bethlehem, for leaving the promised land. I don't know why I survived. I should have made Elimelech stay in Israel. I should have died in Moab too. Ruth asks, so after their deaths, you decided to return to Bethlehem. And despite your protests, I came along with you. Can you explain, what was your relationship with God like at this point? It's a bit complicated. Elimelech and I were determined to never worship an idol while we were in Moab. We decided that before we went. We were going to be faithful to Yahweh, but it's hard to keep all of the laws when no one else is. To keep the Sabbath, to keep the food laws, to keep the Passover and other festivals, to go to the temple. I mean, no one else understands. And as I came home by myself, well, with you and myself, I felt as though God was against me. And maybe he was because of what I'd done. You might remember, Ruth, how when I got back here to Bethlehem, I told everyone, I said, call me Bitter. That's my new name, Bitter. And that's how I felt. God had made my life bitter. And I guess I deserved it. But I certainly didn't feel close to God. Thanks for sharing that, Naomi. But everyone knows the rest of the story, right? You come back to Bethlehem. I marry Boaz. We have a son. We live happily ever after. But can you explain, how did you know that Boaz would even consider marrying me? I was a Moabite. I was a stranger. He didn't know me at all. And you seemed pretty sure that he would want to marry me. Well, besides you being a beautiful woman, Ruth, it's always been very important for Israelites not to let a family line disappear. And so God gave a provision in the law. And this is one of those things that it's remembered and sometimes it's followed and sometimes it's not. But it's this rule that a widow without children could be married by her husband's brothers, by her brothers-in-law. And in that way, if they have children, they don't, for legal purposes, they don't belong to her husband's brother. It's as though they belong to her first husband. So it's a little complicated because she's married twice, but her children, even though biologically the father is the second husband, legally they're the children of the first husband. And so the reason we go through all that sort of complicated stuff there is so that family lines can continue. There's great sadness when a family line is extinguished. And so, since both of my sons passed away in Moab, you didn't have the option of marrying your husband's brother. However, the law actually extends beyond just the brothers. If there are no brothers, it could be a cousin or an uncle. It doesn't really go beyond that, but it could be a cousin or an uncle could what we call redeem you or me, okay, so that we could have children. I'm too old to have children, so it passes on to you, that you could still have a child to keep the family line going. So that's the law, but I didn't know if anyone would want to do that. I had several family members that God's law gave responsibility to take care of us, but that doesn't mean that they're going to do anything about it, because it can be complicated. But when you came home from the fields that day, and you told me that you'd been in my cousin Boaz's field, it was like God just calling out of the heavens and saying, Naomi, I remember you. I haven't forgotten you. And then when you showed me how much wheat you had gathered, it was way more than is usual for just coming along. You're not harvesting the wheat, you're just picking up the scraps, but you had so much. I knew then that Boaz had the kind of generous heart that would step up, that would accept the responsibility to take care of us. Ruth comments, she says, Naomi, this law has always been strange to me. We don't have anything like that in Moab. So let me see if I get this straight. You and I are in a desperate place. We're without husbands. We have some land, but two women can't farm it. That's not practical by ourselves. And so God provides a replacement husband for me. I don't have to go on Match.com and look through everyone. God's just going to take care of it. Naomi answers, yes, Ruth, that's right. And he provides a husband for you and a grandson for me. You know, I think back to that day on the road where you decided to come to Bethlehem with me. Whether you know it or not, that was the lowest point of my life. Even lower than when my husband passed away. Even lower than when I lost my first son and when I lost my second son, because now I still have that loss. They're still gone. And I'm going back a failure, rejected by God. But from that point on, 5 minutes after I'm thinking that, you committed to coming with me. You expressed your love and your care and your concern for me. And then that was just the beginning. God showed his faithfulness to me time and time again. And it's so much easier for me to be faithful to God when I remember that he is faithful to me always. We're going to leave Ruth and Naomi there. I'm reminded of 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 13, as I think of Naomi's last comments of how it's so much easier for her to be faithful to God when she remembers that he's faithful to her. Paul is writing to Timothy. Timothy is apparently is a minister, a traveling minister. He's been sent by Paul to visit churches, and he's having a difficult time. He's encountering problems and doesn't seem to have a real strong or courageous personality. And so Paul is really writing to encourage him. And Paul, in 2 Timothy 2, he quotes what I think is a hymn. It's a piece of poetry that presumably Timothy and many other people were familiar with. He says, here is a trustworthy saying. So you know this saying, and I'm telling you that it's trustworthy. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. As we break down this passage, it seems to be a good description of the roller coaster of faith that Naomi traveled. The first two ideas here in 2 Timothy 2 in this hymn are very much what we expect. They're kind of cause and effect, that if we die with Christ, then we'll live with him. If we endure, if we make it to the end, then we will reign with him. So if we're faithful, we'll enjoy eternity with God, with Jesus. On the other hand, if we disown him, if we walk away from him, then he will give us that freedom to do so, and he won't hold us back. In fact, it says that he will disown us. Okay? So if we free ourselves from him, he will free himself from us. As I say, that seems very much cause and effect as we would expect. But then in verse 13 of 2 Timothy 2, we encounter the grey, okay, the complicated places of our lives. Because it says here, if we are faithless. Now this is different from disowning. When we disown, we say, I don't want anything to do with you. Okay? We disown someone, we say, I am done with you. I am through with you. I'm not having anything. I'm not coming back. Okay? I'm walking away. But if we're faithless, and the idea here is that there are moments in our lives, places in our life, where we don't have the faith that we need. Okay? Maybe we're a new Christian, we run into something that's really difficult, and we don't have enough faith. We step back, we revert to old behaviors and attitudes, sinful, ungodly behaviors and attitudes, in order to try and make our way through this problem. It doesn't mean that we've walked away from Jesus, doesn't mean we've given up on him. It means that we've given in to temptation. It means our faith has not been sufficient, or we haven't called upon our faith at that moment in time. And so in those moments, if we are faithless, they're still not good moments. Nothing about it is good. We're told then, he remains faithful. Okay, this is not the cause and effect that we expect. Okay, if we disown him, he disowns us. If we are faithless, he should be faithless towards us, right? But if we are faithless, he remains faithful, because he cannot disown himself. As children of God, we become the body of Christ, like we become part of his family. God cannot walk away from us. Okay? He remains faithful. And that's what Naomi experienced, isn't it? That when Naomi thought that she was forgotten, thought that she was cursed, when she thought that God had made her life bitter, when she was on the verge of giving up, when not only was her life bitter, but she was bitter towards God. In those times, God was faithful to Naomi. And so there are two things that I want us to take home with us today, as we think about Ruth and we think about Naomi. There's a difference between struggling with our faith and choosing to disown God. If Naomi had have chosen to disown God, she would have worshipped the idols in Moab. She would have adopted their religion. There seems like there is no indication that that is what happened. In fact, when Ruth commits to returning with Naomi, she says, your God will be my God. Ruth recognizes that for her to leave Moab and go to Bethlehem, that she's going to have to change God. She's not going to choose Naomi as her family, but she's going to choose Naomi's God as her God, because Naomi had not worshipped the gods of Moab. Her God from Bethlehem was still her God in Moab. And so even now, as Naomi struggles with her faith, God is faithful to her. And God is faithful to us. When we're in those difficult times, when we're in those dark places, God is still loving. God is still gracious. When we disappoint Him, when we disappoint ourselves, when we let Him down, when we sin, when we give in to temptation, when our faith falls short, when we might feel as though we're faithless and we feel as though that is a death sentence for ourselves, God is faithful because He cannot disown Himself. Until that time that we say, God, I've had enough, I'm out of here, God will remain faithful to us. How faithful was God to Naomi? Well, she became the great-great-grandmother of David. And because of that, further down the line, thousands of years later, or hundreds of years later, 1,000 plus, her descendant gave birth to Jesus. Through Naomi, through Ruth, through David, to Jesus, to you, and to I. God is faithful.